So this week we have Tu B'Shvat, which is itself an interesting holiday, which is not really a holiday, which has been made into a holiday. It's interesting. The first mention of Tu B'Shvat is in the Mishnah, talking about New Year's for the trees, or when different New Years are marked. We usually think about Rosh Hashanah as 1 or 2 days at the very beginning of the year in the month of Tishrei, but the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah denotes several different Roshei Hashanah, different times during the calendar where we denote different things. So this would be the time where we make a distinction between last year's fruit that grew from trees and this year's fruit from trees. And there's a discussion between Hillel and Shammai. Those two are always up to something. Shammai says it's the first of the month of Shvat, where Hillel says it's the 15th of the month of Shvat. So Tu B'Shvat is the 15th, Tet Vav, the 15th of the month of Shvat. So really it's a delineation between last year's fruit and this year's fruit, depending on how we count it, the buds, some part of it, the chanata, the blooming of it, right? So it's really kind of a technical point that's mentioned in the Mishnah, the significance of Tu B'Shvat. However, in the 15th century, the Kabbalists started to look into this and see something a little bit deeper into it. And they actually started something called Tu B'Shvat Seder, which is based on the Seder that we do for Leila Seder, the Seder. And so there's 4 cups, and there's all sorts of different ideas about different wine that we drink. We drink white wine, we drink red wine, and we mix the two. And there's a lot of Kabbalistic secrets there. So kind of with that in mind, I figured if any time was a good time to get a little mystical here, so this would be a good opportunity. And I'm not going to go so much into, Tu B'Shvat Seder per se, or really talk about trees per se. Although really, maybe Tu B'Shvat is most famous these days for kind of being the Israeli Arbor Day or the Jewish Arbor Day and eating dried fruits and that type of thing. But I want to look into kind of a broader question, which has to do with ourselves and how we relate to the environment around ourselves in general. How do we see ourselves in a relationship to the outside world and specifically the environment? Obviously, the climate is something that gets a lot of press, a lot of headlines today. It's a lot of people talking about it in politics, and it would be interesting to see how the Jewish tradition kind of looks at our relationship between the human being and the rest of creation, looking at other animals and nature, at that type of thing, what it has to say about that. So I found a very, very interesting piece in the Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, that's going to outline for us what a relationship looks like between us and animals, or really, the environment or the greater world, and 3 really different perspectives how to read that. One a more minimal, one a kind of in between, and one a more maximal Kabbalistic reading. So on that note, here we go. God created everything with a purpose, right? If we believe that God created you and I and every person, so maybe God's idea for purpose emanates, or rather infiltrates, all facets of creation and not just humanity. So let's see. So the Talmud in Shabbos 72b says as follows. It's a short statement, but it's an interesting statement. Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said, everything that, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda received this tradition from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Everything that the Holy One, blessed be He, created in His world, He did not create anything for naught. And what is the example that He gives? That not only people, human beings, were created with a purpose, but all of nature or all of animal kind was created with a purpose. Here's His example. He created a snail as a remedy for a sore. He created a fly to be crushed and spread as a remedy on a wasp sting. He created a mosquito as a remedy for a snake bite, and He created the snake itself as a remedy for a skin rash. And if that weren't enough for you, he created a gecko as a remedy for a scorpion bite. Now, it's less interesting to me whether or not these are actual, antidotes that work, natural homeopathic remedies that actually work. My position on these things, I know there are different positions. My position on these things is that they had the best Chazal, the rabbis, the sages who wrote the Gemara, put it together, had the best information that they had at the time, and they used whatever remedies were available at the time. But it doesn't mean necessarily that if a fly is not good for a wasp sting, it means that they didn't know what they're talking about. No, if we're talking about medical issues, so we're not necessarily, we don't have to, say that this is true. It says that the Gemara must be true. Or maybe nature changed, and back then the fly guts did help a wasp sting, but these days not. No, this is the best they had. They did their best they had. Okay, so whether or not these are actual remedies is less interesting to me than the broader point that is trying to be made, which is that here you have a number of creatures, and if those creatures prove, so to speak, that, or a proof, not the proof, that God didn't create anything for naught. Now, just from a simple perspective, if I'm looking for God's fingerprint on reality, so to speak, so there's a lot more beautiful animals than a snail or a fly or a mosquito or a snake, right? Talk about the beautiful eagle, or I saw a YouTube video the other day about orcas, about these killer whales. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, they're just enormous, and they're these incredible hunters. There are many ways to see God's power or God's fingerprint or the beauty as created in the world through animals, right? They have these, I forget the name of them. I saw National Geographic show with these incredible birds with all these colors, and they do this dance in order to attract a female. There are beautiful things in creation. None of them are listed here on this. Nevertheless, the fact that there is a purpose for these things teaches us that when God had in mind to create the world, so these things also have a purpose. And I like the overarching idea behind it. In other words, either God is involved in all of creation or none of creation. In other words, if you're going to say that there is a God, there's a higher power that created the world, that's involved with the world, right? So you can't say, well, God created the killer whale, but not the fly or not the mosquito, or this has a purpose in creation, but that doesn't, right? So especially, with modern day science, as we understand it, and ecological systems, we understand how even the most minute part of the ecological system is as important as things that are seemingly on the surface more important. Right, so everything is interconnected. There's ecological chain that weaves through all of existence, which is interesting that they understood something of that way before the science taught them that. And therefore, there's kind of this holistic picture that everything was created with a purpose. It's a nice idea. I think that's just an overall general reading of how I initially read the Gemara. Now, I brought here 3 different Mefarshim in order to expand upon this a little bit more. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start small, kind of more locally, and we're going to expand that outward more globally. Okay, so the most local reading is by the Maharsha, which is Rabbi Shmuel Edels, and in his work Chidushei Agadot, and we'll just read this in English here. He says, the purpose of this teaching, in the Gemara, every one of these is on the Gemara itself. So he says the purpose of this teaching is not to provide a reason for the creation of all beings, but rather that these specific small and weak creatures, which seem unnecessary, but nevertheless they too were created for the purpose of healing. In other words, this is not a global teaching as I read it to you, okay? The Maharsha would not agree with the reading that I just offered to you first, my first reading of it. He says it's not to teach us that everything in creation has a purpose. He's here to teach us that even these small, specific, weak creatures, which really seem unnecessary, like the moth, Who needs the moth, right? I mean, the mosquito, man, especially in the summertime, those things are awful. Like, we could definitely do without them. So no, even those small and weak creatures, which seem unnecessary, nevertheless, they too are created for the purpose of healing. Okay, they have a purpose, and their purpose is healing. So it's a very local reading. Okay, that's the first point that the Maharsha makes. He says a second point here as well. It's kind of a musar, kind of an ethical character lesson that we also see from this Gemara. So after the three dots, he says, God brings about afflictions through small and weak things against the mighty, to tell you that a person should not rely on his strength and prowess. God has many messengers, and if the Lord sends small and weak species, should not appear to you as if they are insignificant, but they are God's messengers against the mighty, as they cause harm, etc. For God has many messengers, and thus is explained the verse that likens the messenger who brings bad news to a strong city, that Israel should not rely solely on their strength. So he makes an interesting point. He says, well, the initial problem that these, in other words, not the remedy that these little animals come to fix, but the initial problem that was caused, those were also caused by small things. So you might think, oh, well, a lion, really, that's something to be concerned about. That's big, that's mighty. I should watch out for that. But, a little sore in my finger, what's the big deal? Well, before they had antibiotics, a little sore can become a very, very big deal. It's to teach us an ethical lesson that even something small and weak can be something that can cause affliction. In other words, there's the kind of scientific cause or the natural cause, but there's also the God cause, so to speak. So the Musar point here being that even if something looks small, don't treat it as if it's not a threat, right? We came out of Corona not so long ago, and we understand that something that we couldn't even see was the cause of major, major sickness and death all across the world, right? So they didn't understand that back then, but we understand now microscopic germs and all these things. So even though they're very, very small, the eye can't even see them, these things can be very toxic, very dangerous, very deadly. To teach us the lesson that we shouldn't be able to rely on our own strength, that really we have to rely on God's strength. And just as a note, and we'll mention our soldiers and lift up with the souls of those people who were killed and the Chatufim, the hostages that are still being held. We thought Hamas really could never cause us any damage, right? This was our weakest enemy by far, right? Can compare them to the power of Hezbollah or Iran or any of these other proxies that are out there to get us. Nevertheless, they cause incredible damage, right? So it's a kind of a good Musar point in line with what it is that we unfortunately experienced and are still experiencing today with the current situation. Okay, just because something is small doesn't mean it can't have a large or impressive impact. That's the second point. First point of the Maharsha is that no, even small things, seemingly insignificant things, have a purpose. Okay, so that's the small local reading of the Maharsha. Let's move on to the Maharal of Prague. He has his own work, Chidushei Haggadah, and he has a short point, but an interesting point to add here. And he's just going to take the lens out a little bit further. So the Maharal says as follows. Quotes our Gemara, Rabbi Huda said in the name of Rav, everything that the Holy One, blessed be He, created in His world, He did not create anything for naught. For everything was created for the sake of man. That's the addition of the Maharal. Everything was created for the sake of man, for humanity. Therefore, it is impossible to say that creatures were created for their own sake. We must say that they were created for the sake of human beings. And if humans had not sinned, even the wolf and the lion would have performed their task for him. As it is written, their duty and their task will be to provide for all the wild animals. Okay, so the Maharal says as follows. What does this teach us? What does this piece in the Talmud teach us? That everything has a purpose for us, for humanity, because we are the pinnacle. We are the cherry on top of all humanity. For us, it was created. And therefore, everything has a purpose for us, which is why even these small animals are a remedy. In other words, there's a purpose for us. There's a healing purpose for us for them. So it's a good reading of the Gemara. It definitely fits. Interesting that he points out here that somehow, I don't know if he means the initial chet, the initial sin of Adam and Chava, or later on, but apparently we would have wolves and lions doing tasks for us. I guess that might even be better than AI tasks doing for us. Now we have AI doing tasks, which might be better, probably safer, and at least cheaper than wolves and lions. So you don't have to worry about feeding them, and you don't have to worry about losing a finger to AI, at least yet, although there are those that are concerned about it. In any case, but the point being that all of creation is for us. Now, I think there's a couple of ways to take that. One way I would say that we should not take that is, oh, since it's all for us, we can do with it whatever we want. Right? That would be like a 6-year-old kid's perspective on how to treat something that, was given to them as a gift. Since it's mine, I can destroy it. I can do whatever I want with it. But that's a very immature perspective, and I don't think the perspective that we're supposed to take. And if we go back to the story of Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden, they're told to guard the garden, to look out for it, to care for it, to be engaged with it, and not to just use it up. In other words, as opposed to saying, oh, it was all created for us, then we can use it up and do whatever we want with it, we have to be mindful of it, and we have to be the guardians of it. We have to be the caretakers of it. That really was the initial goal of Adam and Eve, is in order to be caretakers for the world. And their inability to be able to follow their one positive and one negative instruction, so that reality ended. But the role that humanity plays, I don't think has ended. And therefore, the idea that we have to care for our environment and care for the world, I think that's something that's important. I think that's a value that still plays forward to this day. I think the Maharal would agree with that. Not that we're supposed to just take it and do whatever we want with it, though he lived before the Industrial Revolution, and obviously things have changed. Nevertheless, we are given the world as the caretakers of it. Okay, so therefore, everything in the world has a purpose. So we have to utilize it for that purpose while maintaining care over it, right? And there are specific mitzvot, by the way, that illustrate this. Bal tashchit, not to destroy things. There's a prohibition of wantonly destroying trees when one is at war, fruit trees. Okay, there's several mitzvot that specifically relate to the greater environment around us and the need to care for it and not just destroy it. Okay, so that's what the Maharal says. Now, buckle up, everybody. We're going to get a little bit mystical. As I mentioned, Tu B'Shvat has become really a holiday embraced by the mystics, and the Tu B'Shvat Seder is really is based on the teachings of the mystics. So therefore, we can go to Rav Kook, even though he's known as the father of the Dati Leumi, the National Zionist movement. His thought is really very strongly rooted in the Kabbalah. And when you see certain points that he makes, you see his kind of general worldview, especially here we'll see it, we understand very clearly that the sources that he's working from and the kind of the places that he's jumping off from are clearly from the Kabbalah, or from mystical perspective. Okay. So Rav Kook actually has there are 4 books that are written on Agadah that Rav Kook put together, but unfortunately they're only on 2 Masechtot, 2 tractates, on Shabbat and on Brachot, those 2 tractates. These were early writings of his, and he never got back to that. But they're very, very deep and wonderful writings on the Agadah, if that Agadah happens to be in Masechet Brachot or Shabbat, which this one does, so we're lucky here. Okay, so the words are a little flowery and poetic, but hopefully we'll be able to kind of bring them down and appreciate what Rav Kook is trying to share with us here. So he says, this is directly on a commentary on our piece from the Gemara. Just as the entity of creation is made with wisdom, I put the capital W wisdom because he means divine wisdom. It means that creation is infused with godly wisdom. Just as the entirety of creation is made with wisdom for its ultimate divine purpose, So too, wisdom penetrates all the particulars of the components of creation, without the need to give preference to any aspect of necessity that is not included in the general divine system of wisdom, which branches out into all its details. Okay, I know that's a mouthful. So this is how I understood it, and I think sometimes the English and the translation makes it a little more difficult, but I think this is what Rav Kook is trying to say. He's saying if you look at creation as a whole, all of creation, and just to remind us that Rav Kook here, as far as the different perspective, is going to be the wide lens. This is going to be the widest lens possible through which to read that piece in the Gemara that we saw. So he says, just as the entirety of creation is made with and infused with divine wisdom, in other words, if you were able somehow to step out of all of creation and kind of look at it the way you would look at a picture, or you would look at a movie, so you would see that just as the whole is made up of or penetrated by divine wisdom, so too all of the particulars inside of it, all of the little details, without leaving out one, are all infused with that same divine wisdom. This would be the macro would be the entire world, and the micro would be an exact replica, writ small, of the macro, kind of like a hologram. If you look at them very small, everything is in everything, so to speak. And that's what Rav Kook, I think, is speaking about here. If you look more into the details, all the branches, all the small, tiny parts of existence, that same divine wisdom that is in the holistic general that created the large organic entity called all of creation, that infuses all the tiny parts and all of its little tiny pieces, right? Which is our little tiny minuscule mosquitoes and flies and all the things that the Gemara was talking about. Rav Kook continues here. And all the reasons that seem to us to revolve from one necessity to another are themselves organized according to the superior wisdom and counsel, and divine spiritual and ethical life flows through all of them. See, Rav Kook is using very flowery language here to try to share with us that the organization of all these things, there's a divine flow, there's an energy source, there's electricity, so to speak, divine electricity, which is wisdom and counsel and spiritual and ethical life, right? The word seichel is the Hebrew word that Rav Kook uses. The battery, so to speak, of all of existence, which is not like a battery where a battery gives off energy, right? It's not the battery itself. Here, so to speak, it would be God's energy inside of it. God himself, so to speak, a facet of God, is within all of creation, enlivening it and filling it with God's purpose, God's being, so to speak, God's personality. Rav Kook continues, therefore everything has its purpose that is rooted in the expansion of the creative power which emanated from the point of divine wisdom and kindness. From this teaching, or just pause there, it's not such a stretch for us today to understand this idea of what we call the Big Bang. Rav Kook talks about it in spiritual Kabbalistic terms, which, by the way, that model of the Big Bang existed long before modern science understood it that way, which is very interesting, where all of reality started from an infinitely heavy point and, so to speak, expanded outwards from that. It really works very well with Kabbalah. Rav Kook writes about this. He writes about how that perspective on science works with Kabbalah, how evolution works with Kabbalah. So Rav Kook really embraces a lot of the scientific advances that were happening in his time as well, which is interesting, right? So he says that everything emanated from this one point, and from that one point, which carried the divine within it, everything kind of spread out, and it wasn't weakened by that divine energy that was still at that one point. That divine wisdom still infuses all of creation, even though it spreads out and multiplies into all the different facets of creation that we know today. So Rav Kook ends here. From this teaching, we learn clearly that everything the Holy One, blessed be He, created in His world. He did not create anything for nothing. Going back to the point in the Gemara, Rav Kook is saying, read this as with a wide lens as possible. The klal is in the prat is in the klal. The details are in the big picture, and the big picture is in the details. It's all one organic whole. And now he quotes from Tehillim what we say, what is said in the morning prayers. How great are your works, O Lord. Ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem. How abundant are your works is another way to read that. Rabu is also abundant. You have made them all with wisdom. Word he used very often here. Wisdom, Hashem's wisdom infuses all of creation. The earth is full of your possessions. Everything is a reflection of something of you. Even those things that seem so insignificant are actually also a reflection of you. They're not the highest reflection, right? As we said before, there are beautiful things in creation that are more revealed reflections of the divine, but nevertheless, even those things, this is the teaching that Rav Kook wants us to walk away with, even those things that are seemingly insignificant still share that common root, that common source of being rooted in the divine creative power. So just to go back, we had a minimalistic reading of the Maharsha, and he shared with us, just to go back, go over it quickly. Maharsha said to us that even these small and weak creatures seem unnecessary. No, nevertheless, they have a purpose. They have a remedy. So everything small, specifically small things, not all of the creation, but small things, they also have a purpose. Things you wouldn't think would have a purpose, they do too. And then he gave a kind of a Musar idea that this teaches us that that which is small shouldn't be disregarded. Don't look at everything on the outside. Don't look at something how strong it is. The Maharal, he said that this teaches us that creation was made for the human being. And I added here that this means responsibility as opposed to just using it up for whatever we would like. And then we had Rav Kook, who gave us a very broad, beautiful, spiritual, poetic perspective, taught us that we see that even those things that are seemingly insignificant are all rooted in the whole. The prat is the klal, and the klal is the prat. Everything is really one. Everything emanates from the divine.